Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and friends. Welcome. The year is 1952, Dhaka University, Dhaka Medical College, and Jagannath College. Students from all these three institutes are out on the streets in Dhaka protesting that Bangla be made one of the national languages of East Pakistan. They go out in a procession. The inevitable happens. The police fire. Many are killed. We know 4, 5 names, that's all. But many are killed, many more injured. And that becomes the rallying cry of a nation being born on the basis of a mother tongue. When East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh, Bangladesh, India, and a few others move UNESCO to declare the day on which this happened, 21st of February, this was 1952, 21st of February, declare it as an International Mother Language Day. UNESCO accepts this in 1999, and since then, on the 21st of February every year, worldwide, the International Mother Language Day is observed. It is in this context that we have this colloquium talk this week, by Dr. Dhir Jhingran, about whom I have a write-up. Dr. Jhingran is the founder-director of Language and Learning Foundation, an NGO based in Delhi, focusing on professional development in language, literacy, and multilingual education. He has worked in the primary education sector for over 2 decades, within and outside the government. He was with the Indian Administrative Service. He served as Principal Secretary Education in the government of Assam and Director in the Ministry of Human Resource Development. He has been part of the development and implementation of several EFA, Education for All, programs in the country, including the DPEP, the District Primary Education Program, Janashala, and Sarva Siksha Abhiyan. So his involvement is at many levels, policy making and systemic reform, both in Assam and at the national level. As Chief Program Officer of Room to Read, an international education NGO with which many of our students are familiar with, Dhir led the conceptualization, design, and implementation of early grades reading programs in 9 countries in Asia and Africa. He has helped guide early language and literacy projects in Nepal and Assam. His work in primary education has focused on improving the quality of education, specifically the teaching learning of literacy and language in primary grades. He has made a significant contribution to multilingual education in the country and inclusion of children, his topic for today, belonging to vulnerable and marginalized groups. Dhir strongly believes that equity issues need to be strongly addressed to help children learn everywhere. He has authored 2 books based on empirical research in primary education and contributed to many books and journals. Dhir Jhingran.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is working. I'd like to thank the Azim Premji University, Professor Girdhar Rao, for inviting me here, and of course all the students who are on a protest, probably for very rightful reasons. So today I'm going to speak more as a practitioner than an academic, and I had an interaction with some of your faculty just before this meeting, and really impressed with the erudition and the kind of understanding they have. So I'm sure all kind of academic perspectives you're already getting. I just want to understand how many of you are from the education school? Just to, okay, almost all, right, okay. So the way this, I'm not a good speaker, so I'm going to use the crutches of a presentation. It could get a little technical because I thought I'm coming to an academic institution, so why not? But at any stage we could simply cut that short and discuss the big picture issues. I'll try and talk about 3 sets of things. The first is this, that the way early language and literacy teaching learning is happening in our schools today, and that has been the focus of my research work in the past 4 or 5 years. The second is about the language diversity, which Professor Rao actually specializes in. But what are the implications, therefore, for primary schools? And number three would be to, if we get time, to try and look at what kind of strategies can be used to address these language issues. I have 150 slides. No, not really that many, but many, and we'll try and skip. I just want to start with a small anecdote to give you the context of how multilingual education or languages in education, what's happening at the national front in the past, let's say, 20 years, and completely from my perspective. I was in the state of Assam working with a project called District Primary Education Program, probably much before many of you were born. No, not born really, but you were probably just in early school at that time. This is the mid-90s, and I used to go to schools and observe that I find teachers speaking, explaining quite loudly for considerable lengths of time, and children had blank looks on their faces. And after about 15-20 minutes, then they would be given copying work, which they would do fairly in a busy manner. And this used to happen. I used to go to some tribal villages. I used to go to tea garden areas in many parts of Assam. And that's where my interest in the issue of language and what is the big problem that's happening in our early grades. And then I came to the Ministry of Education, Ministry of HRD, and there I started to support two projects which were coming up. I don't know if you've heard of them. There's a project, MLE project in Orissa and one in Andhra Pradesh. They're only two big, I would say, semi-big 500 schools odd programs in the country. There are no other multilingual education projects really. That time in the late 90s, it was very difficult to talk of MLE in any government forum. It was considered controversial. It was considered something which at least the national government should not get into. So I, as director, because I had this thing, I was very sensitive to these issues, I was supporting these two projects which were beginning to happen, and even within these projects, there were people who were opposed to it. Obviously, whenever something new starts, then the establishment was quite opposed to it. So I remember I used to write letters to these state governments saying this must happen, this is a very good thing, and giving some arguments for it, and then tear away and remove those papers from the government files of Ministry of HRD. Because I didn't want my seniors to see that I had been corresponding with state governments on the issue of MLE. Now, if you're familiar with the government, if you write, I am directed, it doesn't matter. A section officer can write a letter, say, I am directed, and it means the ministry has decided. So it was very easy for me to say, I am directed, and just remove those letters, and go for meetings and promote this. Till, about a year later, one of the secretaries came to the meeting and said, we are very happy that the ministry has been so supportive of our MLE project, and then there was a problem. But I'm just trying. Things have changed, but not too much. Today, if you talk of MLE at the national level, it is still about do something local language, do something 1 or 2 years, do some oral thing, it's okay. But basically, children should learn Hindi or whatever language is there. So not much has changed, though I think the controversy and the taboo part of it may have changed, but not much otherwise. So let me get into this now. As we were discussing before lunch, the language is not just another subject to be taught along with other subjects. It's really about learning. It's about how to think, how to learn. It's the foundation of everything that happens in education later. And this is not understood at the school level or even at the system level. And unless this thinking changes, we will keep doing cosmetic reforms about how language teaching should change. But this understanding that language is being taught and learned for a much larger purpose than to be able to understand what's there in the textbook. And therefore, it's very important that we understand the foundational purposes of language learning. Now, all of you have heard of the Asar report and many other reports which say that children are not learning to read and write and comprehend adequately in primary grades, right? Is there a general understanding about this? Yes? They keep saying that 30% children cannot do this, 50% cannot do this, so that's very common. Now, based on several researches, including the work I have done in 2 states, just looking at some factors, and it's not surprising that children are not able to be able to use language well. This is specifically focused on reading, and when school after school, classroom after classroom, I spent about 200 hours in classroom observations, there was really no reading happening. We'll watch a few videos here just to see. This is a state in northeastern India called Assam. So how many of you have been to schools? All of you. Okay, that's a part of the curriculum, right? Okay. So, and I'm going to try and show you videos from 5 different states. It's as if everyone is united in the way teaching happens, language teaching happens. We are so diverse, but this seems to be the same everywhere. This is, of course, after the teacher has read out the lesson. There's one child who's reading and everyone is repeating. As I went around the class and looked at where children's fingers were, they're all in different places. So no one was actually reading. It was so simple to just repeat after that child, right? And so I'm going to be talking more about the classroom situation. We probably won't even need the, yeah, it's just the visual. I have not taken any classrooms which are exceptions. These are regular classrooms. By design, these are classrooms that are representative of all classrooms. Just to give you a very quick flavor of diverse places so that she's actually a very good teacher, and she's a very good teacher in the sense that she's very empathizing of the children. She speaks to them in their language, but when it comes to reading, who's getting the practice of reading here? I mean, who's it meant for? That's the question that we need to ask. This is, I mean, I just want to show you one more. Okay, this is a girl, when we went to a classroom and said, who is your best reader? The teacher asked this girl to stand up, and she recited the whole lesson completely. She could actually read. She could read. But because reading is so associated with memorization, that basically children are asked to read, that means they have to memorize the lesson and then begin to, you know, even if they cannot read, they can just say it out. She actually just recited that whole lesson, even though she could read. So that's how deep it is. Just to change, this is from Maharashtra, the last one, really the last one, but oh, it came on? It is coming on? Okay. It's a lesson on Subhash Chandra Bose in class. sequence is the same. The teacher reads it out, and there's a sequentiality between reading and understanding. Let's read first, and the understanding is through a few simple recall type questions, what was his name, where did he go kind of thing, and then after that he asks them to write the answers. So the point is that this is what is happening now. We are talking, yeah, you asking something? Sorry, okay. So quite obviously reading is devoid of meaning making, and that's not what is, so as you can see here that the questions that were asked, that are asked in such classrooms, we usually just require a one-word answer, often yes, no, and everyone replies chorally. You know, every child puts up their hand. And a typical reading class, we documented about 50 to 55 classes, and this was the common sequence that a teacher reads out word by word, or often sentence by sentence, asks a few questions, gets choral replies, asks one of the students, or by rotation, to come to the head of the class, read, others repeat, and then the teacher writes some key words or difficult words, then writes the answers for comprehension questions at the back of the lesson, and then children copy the whole lesson. This is not just the lowest common denominator, but the most common thing that we found happening in most places. Teaching is quite focused on textbook content. So the fact, as we started by saying that language is really not about reading that particular content which is in the language textbook. It is about using language to do many higher things. It's about comprehension, understanding, thinking. Now, it's used basically to teach the textbook, which is there, which has got some lessons and some content. I will save time and go to only one of them, which is, this is from Rajasthan, a lesson at the end of class 2. Just note if the lesson itself is appropriate for class 2 or not. And then, of course, what the teacher is how the teacher is. न्यौछावर है इस पे प्राण, अगर हम प्राण त्याग भी दें, ये तिरंगा करके चैप्टर है. Observe what the children are doing. Because this is just. इसके बाद प्रश्न उत्तर पे आ गए. So सीधा. No. This is when they knew they were being observed. Class that. Okay, so he writes the answers. What strikes you? Just 2 or 3 comments on all of them or the last one. What strikes you as a common theme? Any quick comments? There's nothing right or wrong. This is a risk-free environment, I assume, even though your faculty is here. These are very high concept words. Each word, वो प्राणों की आहुति, आक्रमण, त्याग, बलिदान, झंडा. Right. So that is one issue. The other issue that you saw in most of these videos, when you saw the teacher, what were the children doing in most of them? They seem a bit distracted and could not relate to what was happening, or sort of vacantly repeating, just as a mechanical exercise, right? Now, we know that language learning is very different from this. Language is not about this. Writing equals copying and handwriting practice. For example, when we, this is a class, Now, have some of you must have heard of what's called logographic reading. You don't actually read, but you read the pictures of the words, and you've sort of seen the words many times, and you can pronounce those words. I saw logographic writing. Children's memories are very good. They've memorized what the chapter's words look like. Without being able to read or write, this child is writing. The mistakes are there. Sometimes there are mirror images of the letters and all that. But he writes. He writes without being able to read. And that's fairly common. I had done a lot of work in reading, but I didn't know that children would write without being able to read. So that's, anyway, let's just, so obviously our classrooms, there's a lot of oral language, but only from the teacher. There's not much from the children. As I think we've seen in the earlier videos also that there is, I don't know, I've got something. If I have something, I must show you, right? Otherwise, I've spent time on this. Okay, the same teacher. It's a very nice story, but so one-sided. She's using the local dialect as well. Words were spoken in this 45 minutes class, and about 8 or 10 were words spoken by the children, mostly a yes-no kind of response when she asked the question. So obviously we know that. We also know from a lot of research and probably even common sense understanding that reading and writing actually depend upon talk, depend upon oral language development. Unless your oral language is developed, you have a comprehension of language, reading comprehension is not going to happen. We also know that talk is crucial for learning, right? Especially for children who come into school knowing no other medium. They don't know reading. They don't know how to learn through reading. But they know, they listen, they talk, and they form their understanding of the world even before coming to the school through listening and speaking. We are cutting out that strongest medium of the children by cutting out their talk. And talk actually helps explore, if you allow, especially open-ended discussion. I mean, it's not about yes, no. If you were to ask, the teacher was to ask many open-ended questions, suppose for example, पानी किस किस काम आता है, पानी का रंग अगर लाल होता तो क्या करते, or whatever. Anything that stimulates a child to think, because that is the strongest medium for a child to explore. And then the talk has to be of that type. Talk also helps because we know that for young children a lot of learning is social learning, right? You must have. And how can we make it social? Very simple thing. The teacher and the children have a dialogue, children and children have a dialogue in pairs, in groups. And what is the medium for that? Talk. So any number of things. For example, how do children who come from a different home language background, they have to hear that language, right? And use it. That opportunity has to be there. Using formal language. हमारी जो textbooks में होता है, or even in story books, there is a certain formal way of writing. Children have to hear that. In our homes, not our homes, in these government schools, children come from backgrounds where they have not been read aloud to. Story books, they have not been read aloud to. It's very important to listen to way written language is written at the, and it sounds like, which is different from the way they come to school talking to their parents and talking to other children. Written language is a very different way of sentence structures, the density of concepts that is there. Ek bar ek raja tha, I mean, to take the simplest thing, but many other things. So I think talk is a medium that we don't encourage, especially exploratory talk. To understand anything, get to the depth of anything, it's important to look at talking. Of course, it should actually start in preschool or early childhood education. That's the best place where, unfortunately, our early childhood education is not doing that well. There is a new curriculum, but things should change slowly, but nothing much. It's still very, very K, K, G and ABC oriented in many places. So just sort of recap. Now, all of you are aware of the word time on task? It's a general concept, like how much time does a child in a 45-minute class spend doing something related to that class? We don't get very ambitious and say it has to be a good learning kind of task. This repeating and copying is not included. No. Doing anything related to the class, what would you expect that time to be in a 45-minute class as in percentage terms, where the child is doing anything relating to the class? Just doing anything. No value judgments. Don't say that repetition is not good, memorization is not good. It's okay. Any wild guess? So about 70%, 70%, 70 or so? Yeah, that would be a normal expectation, 70 to 80% doing something or the other. So now this was done across a very large number of classrooms to get a reliable, I don't know, you may not be able to see it from there. It is focused on some of the big ones here. This one, no meaningful activity. Now, this happens for two reasons. One is, of course, there is no teacher in the class. That is quite common. Either it's a multi-grade situation, or the teacher steps out or comes late. So this is clocking the time from the time the period starts till the period ends across a few hundred classrooms, language classrooms in grades 1, 2, and 3. About 40% of the time, children were not doing any activity connected with language, right? Then we can come to things that we don't fully agree with. Choral repetition was happening 11% of the time. Copying from the blackboard was happening almost 20% of the time in this state, etc. But the startling thing is this, that if you're having a 40-minute class and out of that almost, say almost half of it or 40% of it, the teacher is not able to, and we saw example where even the teacher is in the class because the level is so high and the teacher is just teaching the textbook, children are disengaged. So this 40% is not teacher absence from the class only. A majority of this is with teacher presence, but children not engaged. Is this point okay? The figures don't matter. It's just that if this is the story, then I think we are not even managing to keep the children engaged in what was happening in the classroom, let alone doing tasks that are learning type. Okay, of course, we do not have good reading materials. I think it's crucial in a language class to have children a variety of rich story books and reading materials with a lot of pictures to encourage them to read, to try and read, a desire to read, and that is of course not there. And then how many of you have gone to school and observed that a classroom has got children of different levels? Have you actually felt it? Did you assess? Did you try and assess it also in some simple way? So this is the reality. Every classroom today is a differentiated classroom for a variety of reasons. I mean, we don't have time to go into this, but the teacher doesn't have a solution. She has to cover the textbook from cover to cover, and now with something called Continuous Comprehensive Evaluation, CCE, it's laid down in the first 2 months. You've got to do these chapters. It was always there, but it's become somewhat more rigid in some states. Teachers covering the textbook, not looking at the child who's not able to read, who's not comprehending, whose home language is different. So that's a big situation. So from the time on task table, something that comes out is that if you remove 40% of the time, how much are we left with? 60%. 50% of 60% is how much? 30%, right? So if you add these figures of chanting and copying, it's about 30% of the total time, which is 50% of the time they were doing something. They were doing something. Of that, half the time they were only repeating or copying. Again, this is grades 1 and 2, average of grades 1 and 2. Anyway, the idea is this, that this is how instructional time is quite low for language, because we consider, in this research, 75% of the teachers said that English and maths are more difficult, I need to spend more time on that. And therefore, we were trying to argue for more instructional time for Hindi, for language. Because we were talking about foundational skills, we were talking about how it's not about teaching the textbook, it's about doing a variety. It was about how do you take out time for oral work? That's how it all happened. I said, no. But the point is, I have to focus on English and maths. Now, this mindset that this language, which is the medium of all learning, is the vehicle for all learning, requires more time, especially because you provide 40 minutes, you end up with a child being engaged for less than 10, 15 minutes. So, you've got to do something about it. Okay, so just to conclude, student learning time. We've not even gone to this. So, there you will come up with all your fine arguments, but chanting is not learning, but this, so you'll reduce it further, right? This is where it is. This is where at least children are engaged in doing a language-related task of whatever type it may be. Why is it so small? Okay, so just to conclude this whole thing, the first part of my presentation, I don't know how we are doing, we'll stop we'll not do the last one, but so what I found and what many other researchers have found in the field and there's elsewhere as well in Southeast Asia, everything looks very demonstration and presentation oriented. The teacher has to present the lesson. So he or she is going to talk and read the lesson, go through the motions of asking some questions and getting some engagement. So it's all very performance oriented, demonstration oriented, like a safe play is going on. Everyone looks busy when you go into that classroom. Teacher is speaking, children are repeating, then children are bending on their notebooks and copying. Not much learning is happening, that's different. But it is a classroom that appears quite busy from the outside to a visitor. So these are safe presentational practices that are going on and not the kind of talking and discussion and follow through after reading that should be happening for children to be learning. We know that learning language actually requires very rich and meaningful use of language. Extend the children's imagination using a text so that they can talk about various things. Let loose the powers of language, but that's something which is not happening. Of course, for children who come with a different language background, we all know that we learn language, oral language through exposure to it, right? That's the easiest way. When we were kids, there were people at home speaking that language and we picked it up automatically, right? Now, but the second language, suppose the child has come to school and trying to learn a second language, which is not even being taught. If it is being taught, it's being taught just through the textbook. Now, did our parents ever teach us the language, as sat you down and said, now let's read Ka, Kha, Ga and teach this, these are the rules and principles? No, we picked it up. And the way for language acquisition, whether it's first or second language, is similar. Now, it's true that you cannot get a child to take 3-4 years to learn a new language, like the way we do at home. But there is a case for a lot of meaningful use through stories, talking, etc., which will result in much better language acquisition than just reading out a textbook and doing some copying work after that. So the children who suffer the most are those who do not fully understand the school language because they have not been given any allowance whatsoever, any scope, any allowance to get time to listen to that language in meaningful, interesting contexts, to be able to speak without being under pressure to write a test, etc. So that's a problem. And this, of course, we've discussed already. And there's a linguist and anthropologist from the US, Edward Spare, who basically says that, language, in the context of the fact that there's little talk happening, language is not used, basically says it's like a dynamo which could have powered an elevator, a lift, but it's being used only to run an electric doorbell. The limited use of language in the classroom where there's no exploratory talk, children don't speak, don't think about things, comprehension is limited to yes, no answers. The power of language is being used to a minimal 1%, 2%. Something which is so powerful to do so many things, to be the basis of all learning. So to me, the biggest message for teachers, for the government system, for education system is that recognize that language learning is different from, and we were speaking just before lunch and we were emphasizing that so eloquently. And that's very, very crucial. And that's the thought that we also had. So this is okay, this is like a summarization. What was wrong and therefore what should happen. So let's not bother about this. Just take 2 minutes on a classroom that looks a little different. Rag pickers in Madhya Pradesh. The NGO is Muskan. These are Gondi speaking children, but no Hindi because they are in an urban area. Quickly, just 2 or 3 things that you found different here. Come on, can we get some quick responses? Yes, so the context, and therefore you can see they can contribute strongly, they are not, yeah, that's one. So it's not like, yes, that's right, yes. Children's, but I think the very crucial thing here is the active engagement of children. They seem animated and interested in what's going on, not passively just listening to what the teacher is saying. Of course, I mean, one may agree or may not agree with some of the practices, but about learning to read, but it's really, really very different. So that's just an example. You know, if we had time, we could have done an exercise of listing how these two are different. So the point is, as I said, so we conclude one part of it. We'll probably do only the second one now, which really is Professor Rao's area, but from a very primary education perspective of what is happening in classrooms. This is, okay. Have you come across this concept? I'm sure you have. Have you? In some other terminology. Very commonly in the education system, every teacher you go to says, these children come from a background where there's no support at home. In this research, 85–90% teachers said why children are not, the question was, why are children not learning? The answer was not about classrooms or anything. It was all about their home and themselves. Their languages, their homes, no support at home, etc. So the point is this, that there are serious deficits with these children, right? They come with a deficit, and that's a big problem for us, right? They don't come in a shape that they can be taught in the way we want to teach, right? So again, from a socio-cultural perspective, to try and look at a difference with what they've come in. You know, they come in, their language is not inferior. I mean, if a Lamani child or a child who's speaking Sadri is able to communicate in his or her language completely for whatever he or she wants at the age of 5, that language is sufficient for that community in the context in which they're living. It's a full language. Yes, it is different from the Hindi or whatever we use in the classroom. It is different. But it's different. It's not that you are lower here and this is Hindi. There's a gap. There's a difference between horizontal and vertical. Looking at the difference as a difference versus looking at you are here and you have to come up here. If that is the understanding, then what happens? Then it's easy to say, this gap cannot be bridged. This deficit cannot be bridged. What do? I have to read the textbook, teach the textbook, or do I work on this? So I think just shifting to the fact that these cultures, these languages are different but not inferior. They're different. And this is a very common situation in rural India. And therefore children from backgrounds who have had no exposure to literacy, they have not had a storybook, no one has read out to them, they have not seen print in their homes, there are no magazines or newspapers. But what do we start with? We start with Ka Kha Ga. The first thing is to get the child to understand what is print used for, that there can be a story in it, there can be a letter written in it, to understand what we say functions of print. First thing is to understand that print is useful for a variety of things. If you start with Ka Kha Ga and wait till for 1 year for the child to understand how will I use this Ka Kha Ga, for a child who knows that and is coming from a home where there's been a lot of print exposure, the child knows that I'm doing this for some time to access the books and storybooks that have been read out to them already. But a child who this hasn't happened, doesn't know that connection. So can in the early months for such children, we focus on read alouds, functions of print, how do you understand, even if they cannot read, a lot of oral language work to bridge this difference between what they speak at home and what is formal language, what is the language in the storybook. So just looking at this lens is crucial. And therefore school is institution for all and not just those who are already coming prepared. There are children who come already prepared. In nursery, many kids, even in government schools, come after having learnt the alphabet. And they're ready. They're ready to start learning decoding and start forming words, but many kids are not ready. So is the school ready to look at what should be done for kids who are not ready? Okay, this is just general stuff. Quite obvious, based on what we've discussed, that you have to think to learn, and thinking can happen only in a language that is developing or fairly developed or can be used for thinking, right? Of course, there is a concept that, abstract thinking and use of academic language takes many years, but obviously you can think in a language that you know well. Everyone agrees our teaching, our education should move from known to unknown. Why do we use a language the child doesn't really know? I mean, then the basic principles of whether you say NCF or constructivism or whatever are beaten here. Of course, learning to read and write is the easiest in the language you know, because then you have to only break the code. What are the symbols for Ka, Kha, Ga, what are the sounds, and you can, I mean, a very simplistic way start to understand. Of course, validating language, culture and identity are so connected that if you try and if you don't recognize the language, there is a problem here. And of course, children learning through a different medium, that is the biggest disadvantage that a child can face. I won't, this is becoming, has anyone heard of balance theory? You've talked, no, is that okay? Balance theory? No. Simple logic, very, very plausible, very feasible. If I was a person, or if you hadn't been exposed to education, for example, it says that if the knowledge and understanding of one language goes up, then the second one comes down, right? It's as if the brain has only this much space for languages. If you work on developing one, the second one will remain stunted or will not grow that much. It's like if you were to inflate a balloon in the brain and one balloon of one language takes more space, what happens to the second balloon? Space is less, right? So it cannot grow that much, right? So that's the balance theory, basically saying that, or the balloon theory, that two languages, this was something which was quite strongly thought about earlier. In the US today, even now, my brother's child was not taught any Hindi till they felt it was safe, and he was at a level where he was at the native English speakers level. It still holds. I mean, everyone in the Indians, at least in the US, believe that monolingualism till that. Until you can start some Hindi classes at home for the child. This is what happens later. But the point is this, that basically this assumes that languages don't interact. Languages remain in separate compartments. If you develop one language, that has to be at the expense of the other language. But that's not true. There's a lot of research to say that's not true. At some bottom level, there is something common about languages, about the thinking process that helps feed both languages and receive inputs from both languages. So the whole thinking process develops using inputs from both languages, and from that thinking process, expression can also happen in different languages, which at surface may look quite different. Now, this is not, as a theory, not very well proven, but this fact that bilingualism does not in any way hinder cognitive development. Some people say it actually promotes in some ways. But so this understanding that if you were to develop two languages almost parallelly and get the child to be strong in both languages, the child will be as good a learner in both languages as when you had taught the child only one language. In fact, the counter argument is that bilingual children especially, are more flexible in many tasks that they can, because they have to quickly, if they have to express in one language, they've got to adjust, think of this and change. So their minds are much more flexible in certain cognitive demands, but that's too intricate. The point is, this is all wrong. It is important to understand that, but there is a caveat to this. Both languages must be developed properly and fully. The way we do, we may pay lip service. For example, in some projects, we do teach some oral language, Sadri for some time, and then, okay, this is just like that. And then mainly we are focusing on Odia or Hindi or whatever. The caveat here is that if any one of the languages is not developed properly, then that becomes a stumbling block for cognitive development, at least through that language. So it's not serving a purpose. So the point is, when we talk of bilingualism, biliteracy, especially through education, not if you're outside, we pick up many languages anyway, then it should be that we respect both languages and develop them through a degree of, okay, I'm going to just run through this now. Okay. So children in our schools face a language disadvantage. And that's true. There are children, we were discussing again before lunch, children who are migrants, who live in interstate borders, tribal children who have very different language, but also children who we consider speaking that language. For example, Chhattisgarhi. It's a completely different language. I mean, its origins are similar, there are similarities with Hindi, but if you go to Chhattisgarh school, they'll say, हाँ वो बोली घर की dialect है, but Hindi आती है. Now that's a problem. So therefore, the point is this, that So many children who actually speak a language which is considered a slight variant of the school language, but actually it's a full language in that sense. So there are many children who face this. We could have started to list them, but it's okay. So there are very varied language situations in the country, and they are along these dimensions. What are the children's first languages? First languages are the languages they know very well. They speak fluently when they come to school. Not get into mother tongue or anything else, but what is the medium of instruction? What does the teacher speak? What does the teacher use in the classroom for instruction? This can actually be very different from medium of instruction. In my research, I found that classrooms, 80% of the time can actually be in the children's languages if the teacher knows them. While English is being taught or Hindi is being taught, the teacher is speaking constantly in the mother tongue, right? Because she knows that's the only way I can get across to the children. The lesson is too complex. But it is done not in a strategic or in a structured manner that can help children learn. And there's very little data around what do children know when they come to school. Okay, it of course differs on how different the school language is, how different is it from the home language. There are many factors which determine. It's not correct to assume the child speaks a different language at home, she's at a disadvantage. No. Nowadays, because of exposure to media, or parents may be speaking the school language with the child at home just to not put the child at a disadvantage. So we need to know a lot of things about what is the exposure outside school, for example. For English, is there any exposure outside school? For Hindi, there may be. So there are different factors before we assume how strong is the disadvantage. So I think I'll stop here and not go into strategies. We were going to start with multilingual education. But I'll stop here, and if this point comes up about, therefore, what do we do in school, we'll try and discuss that through a few question and answers. Thank you so much.
Conversation. The floor is open.
Yeah, you should ask, otherwise I'll go through my remaining slides. Okay. Yeah.
So you talk about the language, but the thing is, if you going to teach a student in their own language, it's very difficult because they have many language in the same area. Somebody is talking about, because I worked in a Pratham in Asar survey, so I know that the difficulty what the teacher facing in the classroom. I asked the teacher, why not you are teaching their own language? So he told me that it's very difficult. There are 3 categories of children. How can we teach them in their own language?
Yeah. Shall we take a few questions and then?
Shall we do a couple of more questions and then all 3 can be answered or addressed?
Yeah, so my question is that I have been visiting Kendriya Vidyalayas and I have realized that in one class there are students speaking about 10 to 14 languages. That's a reality. So how does multilingualism work in a scenario like this?
Just to complicate matters, in our 14-member class in this university, we came up with a list of 25 languages. So, yeah. Thank you.
So, how important is learning the script of a language? I mean, like sometimes for me, it's like mother tongue. I know it as only to speak. I don't use it. So, I have many friends who grew up with me like that. So how is learning a language without script, is that a possibility somehow?
Okay, let's deal with these. Okay, you seem to have asked the most difficult questions where you were sure that answers are unlikely to be available, and no ready answers really for these several languages inside a classroom. The point is, one, as I said, therefore, if you remember, I devoted half of what I spoke to how language teaching practices themselves can change, allowing a lot of oral language work in the classroom, where the teacher could speak in one language, the children would speak what you were saying, children could reply in their own language, at least ensuring that children get to express themselves, their oral comprehension improves, and you give that adequate time before you say, no, that's not important, let's start to write whatever the formal standard language is. So on that particular thing, there are really no ready-made answers, except that a lot of work where children are allowed in the classroom to speak their own languages in response to questions, for example, and these are valued and agreed as correct responses if the teacher knows them, these languages. And the other is, therefore, not starting to simply do K teaching right away. That's one way of looking at it. The other is that if there are not too many languages, I mean, except for urban situations and a lot of rural areas, you'll find 2, at most 3 languages. It is possible to have a lot of story books in these languages. And these story books can be read aloud by the teacher or by a child from a higher class who knows that language, and introduce the written language of that language to the children. So there are a few things that can be done, but otherwise it's true. And again, Kendriya Vidyalaya, the situation is slightly different. The background from which children come, they don't necessarily, I mean, often there is some exposure to Hindi. English is an issue, but Hindi there is some exposure. We are not starting at the level where children have no familiarity with, let's say, Hindi or English. The other difference in Kendriya Vidyalaya often is that there is home support and high aspirations. Often this counts a lot. When there are high aspirations to learn a language or do well at school, or there is exposure to media like TV, etc., the household is literate, many of the things that school is supposed to do for children who are from these deprived backgrounds actually get taken care of at home. So many of these problems that children could face in early classes in Kendriya Vidyalaya are sort of taken care of by exposure to media, very high aspirations for kids to do well, getting them, speaking to them in Hindi or English or whatever is the language at home, which helps in many ways. Navodaya Vidyalaya, for example, also. They in fact come from a very different, sometimes language background, then they start with Hindi and English. So I won't be so concerned about Kendriya Vidyalaya, though it's a good case study to look at how do children cope with these languages. Script of a language is least important. I mean, in the sense that you can write any language in any script, theoretically. You can just write. So, and typically a lot of these multilingual programs that are happening in a few states, these languages are being written usually in the state languages script. So in Orissa, in Oriya, Telugu, in Andhra Pradesh, the understanding is, let's not burden the child with learning new scripts. What is important is, if the child knows the language well, in your case maybe, I don't know, at this age you know the language well, but I don't know what, but the script is the least important. If you can read the language in another script, that's fine.
So in this case, like when 2 or more languages are learned simultaneously in the very early age, so does that make, like you spoke about this monolinguistic, this obsession with monolinguistic in Western or US, for example, you said. So when this being is, when this 2 or more languages are learned simultaneously, so there could be differences in how the letters in script. Basically, my question is how the letters are in words and grammar, and at further stages it may go to grammar, but initially how the words are formed, connected and all. So yes. Does that, like, is there any, from your experience?
There is an issue because some languages are quite dissimilar in terms of origin, in terms of structure. To say that Hindi and English, it's quite different. There could be some things in common that the child may figure out, but not everything. Yes. So if you're not insisting on reading and writing initially, then the child is capable of listening to and learning. As we said, the constraint is how how is the language being taught to the child? If it's going to be taught as teaching a lesson, textbook lesson, you cannot learn. But if it is through a lot of storytelling, reading aloud, conversation, vocabulary, etc., then that's a very different thing. Then 2 is no issue, no problem at all. I mean, we're talking about your child who has learned Kannada and Hindi. So that's, I don't think we should be concerned at all about that, and even English for that matter. As long as we don't get demanding that we'll do an assessment now, now there'll be an ABCD wala test, then there's a problem. Then you are imposing conditions which are not the best for acquiring newer languages. That's the issue.
Okay. When you talk about language being medium, so I always had this problem because I am somewhat visual thinker. I get pictures instead of languages. So probably there are many other ways exploring child's mind. So how you confine those ideas in language, and what happened to that?
So, sorry, should I respond? Okay. So, I am a pragmatic dreamer in the sense that I completely agree with you that you have to look at multiple ways in which children can respond and understand. But I do know that our classrooms may not change that much, that quickly in my lifetime, in yours maybe. But to look at how, let's use at least a medium that the teacher knows, the children know, the parents know, that's recognized as a medium that you have to do well in. You have to read to learn. Most of your literature, most of the learning will happen through reading. So I agree there's a big limitation, and dimensions like visual are not included, but looking at reality. So there's a difference between a realist and someone who wants to do something but in a limited way.
Hello. So I had a question about the mindset or attitude that you spoke about towards languages being inferior. So when I had gone to a few schools in a district in Chhattisgarh, so we asked them this question that, why don't you teach them in Chhattisgarhi? I mean, even the teacher speaks Chhattisgarhi at home, even the students are speaking. Yeah. So her attitude was, Chhattisgarhi is a backward language, you can't do anything with Chhattisgarhi, why should we teach them? They won't go forward learning Chhattisgarhi. Right. So it's useless, a waste of time teaching them in Chhattisgarhi. Right. So how do you change that kind of mindset or attitude towards?
Again, no easy answers, but we were again discussing, it seems like everything we discussed before lunch is coming back here. So it's like, to be able to talk to teachers and parents and administrators to say that, fine, we are not trying to get children to do very well in Chhattisgarhi. But we know, based on the arguments that we've discussed, that isn't talking important, isn't thinking important. Chhattisgarhi is going to be the foundation for learning Hindi and English very well. We are not concerned about Chhattisgarhi. We know that Chhattisgarhi is very important for the child in the early years, but we have one objective, like you have, child to learn Hindi very well and the child to learn English very well. But we also know that the best route to doing that is to learn your own language very well, and Chhattisgarhi and Hindi actually have so many linkages that can be established very simply through reading aloud, through oral conversations, through pointing out some common things, that it's possible to do a lot of work in Chhattisgarhi, and meanwhile children do get a lot of understanding of Hindi also. The point is that we are not promoting, this is an example of Chhattisgarh, they agreed readily, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, ठीक है, oral language में आप करिए, that they gave permission, that okay, you do oral language work for 2 years, you do in Chhattisgarhi, that's okay. Reading, writing नहीं हो सकता, they don't allow, they won't allow you to do. So he said Chhattisgarhi story books, read aloud, वो तो oral है, ठीक है, that was allowed. So like that we got about 3 or 4 things we could do with children and give them at least 2 years for them to hear Chhattisgarhi, use Chhattisgarhi, hear Hindi, use Hindi, preferably not in watertight time periods, because what happens otherwise they'll say, okay, ये oral language का time है, यहाँ Chhattisgarhi कर लेते हैं, इसके बाद Hindi में करना है काम. So we said oral language time is a time where both languages, read aloud a story in Chhattisgarhi, read aloud the same story or same story preferably in Hindi, talk to children, Let them use words which are Chhattisgarhi words also. You, without correcting them, use the different Hindi word. That was allowed. So I think we've got to find ways in which we break this thing without challenging them and saying, you are wrong. Just going along with them. We also, of course, try to get them normally exercises like this. Think back of your childhood and what did you feel in school. Sometimes they work, sometimes don't work. They said, no, we were comfortable with Hindi, then it fails. But there are ways in which you've got to make progress. It's not easy though.
So my question is, if you have a multigrade and a multilingual classroom, would language learning be easy, difficult, or how can a teacher go about doing?
What's the link with multigrade though?
The idea is just to understand whether language learning would be better or learning itself.
Oh, there are children of
different ages together.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I haven't looked at the problem from this perspective, but multigrade, I mean, we have a lot of small schools today. I hope you're aware that in rural areas now class sizes are coming down to 10, 15, 5, 7, except for urban areas, class sizes are becoming small and multigrade will continue. I'm sure there are advantages of where the older kids can read out, can sit with younger kids. I'm sorry, I'm not explored this, but I think it's a good issue to look at.
Yeah, and here is a question, please.
Sir, the child who is knowing one language and the child who is knowing one language and other child is knowing more than 3 or 4 languages, is this thing is helping in their cognitive development?
He's saying that if a child is bilingual, trilingual, is there a benefit to the child's cognitive development from that? Would you like to take on that? No, I mean, I have some answer, but I think you were more...
No, very briefly, research is now showing that at least bilingualism gives a cognitive advantage, and what I understand is even in a place like US now, everybody is saying, introduce another language in school, let them start learning, so that seems to be something.
Provided we do it well, again the same caveat, you allow both languages to prosper and develop. Otherwise, it is stunted.
In fact, even in old age, apparently, bilingual people's onset of dementia is delayed by 4 years or something. So there's something to look forward to.
I didn't quote that because anyway.
We all have hope. Yes. I just wanted to respond to this multimedia, modal.
Yes.
I believe that language itself is a multimodal phenomenon, even though we seem to think of it as merely linguistic and not visual. How much of our understanding, when I'm speaking, for instance, when you are watching me, it depends on the whole kinesics of it. You know, what is the facial expression, what's the gesture, and what is the posture, right? So many things. So language inheres, I think, in a multimodal kind of a way. But in our understanding and talking and teaching it, we just forget that and reduce it to the most minimal, the linguistic, and teach it. That's why nobody learns.
Right.
Nobody is able to learn effectively. That's one comment. And I had another comment to make. And see, like as language people, we are faced with one paradox. Outside our classrooms, outside our school system, people learn and live in and with several languages. All the languages that they need to know, they learn. And how much they need to know, they learn. And whatever they want to do with it, they just do with it and get by and go on. Whereas here, in the education system, we teach them from anywhere up to 12 to 15 years, let's say if you take graduate, up to graduate. So they do 10, 12, 15 years of schooling, education in language, and yet they're not able to learn as much as they want to, despite formal teaching, making provision for it. Yeah. So what is it that we are not doing right then, right, within the school system, which the world outside seems to be doing right?
use language for practical purposes?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Just so that's why for me, when people ask a question like, you know, like in multilingual classes, what do we do with so many languages, right? We do what we do outside. So let them be. We'll use it when we need to, if we need to, and use only as much as we need to get on with that particular context, right? Therefore, it is kind of posed to you as a kind of a you know, impossible challenge, right? What do we do with it now? You know, like I'm a translator. For instance, everybody is very fond of asking a translator. There is a sentence in Kannada, for instance, which says, what is your rank in the family as a child? See, such an awkward question. In Kannada we say, "Neen eshtne maglu," or "Neen eshtne magu," for your family. In English, it's very difficult to which the child are you in the family. So it's one of those impossible things to translate. So they suppose that one thing and say, come on, translate it. As though 99.9% of the rest that I have translated doesn't matter at all. So multilingualism is like that,
good point. Yeah,
right?
Not all classrooms have 5-7 different languages. Urban areas, yes.
Any last questions? Yes.
I don't know whether I'm on the right track. I just want to know that when we are reading aloud a story, we have a different purpose for it, but then how do we read aloud with a chapter? When we're teaching a lesson, how do we use read aloud to take a lesson?
What should be the difference? Because if you're talking, if it's about young children, they should have a lesson that can be read aloud to them in a similar way the way you read aloud a story. Because I think in early grades, all the text that they should have should be easily comprehensible, not like the Tiranga that we saw. So they should be read aloud like you read aloud a story to a child. And after that, you're asking the child to look at the pictures, predict, talk, what will happen next, ask a few questions when the child talks about something. So read aloud is for listening to written text in a model way, but also doing a lot of comprehension work and getting the child to look, use their imagination, creativity, ask questions, etc. So if we are saying that the text is very distant from what you think is a good read aloud, then the text has to be thrown out. So the problem then is that our textbook language teaching is not best done through a textbook, which has been written centrally by someone in some context. So we have to use a variety of texts and stories, even if it's information-based text, at the level of the child, which can be read aloud the way you read aloud. Read aloud is read aloud.
So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Jhingran.